The Neutron's Edge wasn't exactly what you'd call a classy establishment. Then again, when your clientele consists primarily of battle-scarred veterans from 17 different species and the occasional smuggler with more warrants than appendages, classy isn't exactly high on the priority list. Zix'Thrax sat at the bar, his primary drinking tentacle wrapped around what had to be his 8th glass of Centaurian bile whiskey. His typically iridescent scales had dulled to an almost pathetic shade of grey-green, which happened to match perfectly with his current mood. The 3 diagonal scars across his central sensory ridge, normally a point of pride among Kazari warriors, seemed more like marks of shame tonight. "Come on, tell us what really happened," chirped an annoyingly enthusiastic Verdani youth, their bioluminescent antennae practically vibrating with excitement. "Everyone knows the Kazari Empire withdrew from the Sol campaign, but nobody knows why." Zix'Thrax's secondary breathing sacs deflated in what his species considered a sigh. "Kid, some stories are better left untold. Some wounds are better left unopened." He took another swig of his drink, grimacing as the caustic liquid burned through his first and second stomachs. "But you were there." The Verdani's companions, a chrome-plated mechanoid and a gelatinous blob of indeterminate origin, leaned in closer. "You were the fleet commander's chief tactical officer." "Ex-chief tactical officer," Zix'Thrax corrected, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen things, terrible things, things involving what humans called cat videos, and something even more horrifying known as dad jokes. The bar's ambient noise seemed to dim as other patrons noticed the conversation. Even Raxthal, the bartender, with all 6 of their eyes, turned to listen while absent-mindedly polishing a glass with their prehensile tail. "Fine." Zix'Thrax's dorsal spines flickered in resignation. "But I want it known that I'm only telling this because I'm drunk enough to think it's a good idea, and because maybe, just maybe, it'll serve as a warning to others." He straightened up, his full 3 meters of height impressive, even while seated. "You younglings probably don't remember, but there was a time when the mere mention of the Kazari Empire would cause planetary systems to surrender preemptively. We had subjugated the Krex Collective in 3 solar cycles. The Martian remnants, they became our tributaries after a single battle. The notorious space pirates of the Crab Nebula, they literally changed careers and became accountants." The mechanoid's cooling fans whirred in appreciation. "The statistics support your statement. The Kazari Empire had a 100% success rate in military campaigns prior to the Sol incident." "Exactly." Zix'Thrax's scales briefly flashed their old warriors purple before fading back to their defeated grey-green. "We were the apex predators of the galaxy. Our battle doctrine was studied in every military academy from the Horsehead Nebula to the Outer Rim. Our technology was centuries ahead of most species. Our warriors were literally bred for conquest." He paused, staring into his drink as if it might contain answers to questions he'd rather not ask. "And then we met the humans." The blob rippled in what might have been anticipation or indigestion. It was always hard to tell with their kind. "But they're just bipedal primates," the Verdani protested. "Their primary weapons still use chemical propulsion, for Star Maker's sake." Zix'Thrax's laugh carried all the mirth of a funeral dirge. "Oh, my sweet summer lava. That's exactly what we thought too. Chemical propulsion, nuclear fission, internal combustion engines. We saw them as primitive, barely worth the effort of conquest." His central eye twitched. What we couldn't understand, was that their technological advancement had nothing to do with why they were the most terrifying species we'd ever encountered. He drained his glass and gestured to Raxthal for another. "Want to know what makes humans different? They don't follow the rules. Any rules. Ever. It's like they took the Universal Manual of Warfare, used it as toilet paper, and then made origami out of it just because they were bored." The assembled aliens leaned in closer as Zix'Thrax's voice dropped to just above a whisper. "Let me tell you about the species that broke the unbreakable Kazari Empire. Let me tell you about the time we thought we were going to subjugate Earth and instead learned a lesson about why some planets should just be marked with a sign that says, 'Don't even think about it.'" Zix'Thrax motioned for his companions to get comfortable, his scales shifting to the storytelling patterns that all Kazari warriors used for important tactical briefings. The Verdani pulled up a stool, the mechanoid adjusted their servos to attentive listening mode, and the blob, well, The blob just sort of sloshed there expectantly. Our first contact with Earth wasn't even meant to be significant, Zix'Thrax began, absently running a claw along his scarred sensory ridge. Standard procedure, long-range scans, cultural analysis, threat assessment, you know, the boring stuff that usually ends with us deciding how quickly to conquer a planet. He chittered in what might have been embarrassment. Our initial scans showed a level 3 civilization, barely space-capable, still burning fossil fuels, fighting among themselves over arbitrary geographical boundaries. The most advanced weapons we detected were nuclear devices that would have barely scratched our lowest-grade shields. The mechanoid's display panel flickered with calculated interest. Assessment. Easy conquest. That's exactly what we thought. Zix'Thrax's scales flashed an irritated orange. Our cyber warfare division was so confident, they didn't even bother with their usual preparation rituals, just plugged right into what they called the primitive information network to disable their communications. He paused to take a long drink. 3 of our best cyber warriors had to be treated for psychological trauma after encountering something called Twitter. They still can't talk about it without their neural processors glitching. The Verdani's antennae twitched in confusion. But surely your advanced AI systems could handle their networks. Zix'Thrax let out a sound that might have been a laugh if laughs could convey existential dread. Our AI took one look at human internet traffic patterns and declared them mathematically impossible. Do you know how hard it is to break an AI? Our systems tried to analyze their memes for strategic value and ended up in a logic loop, trying to understand why humans were so obsessed with pictures of small felines with grammatically incorrect captions. But surely the cultural analysis provided useful data. The blob rippled inquisitively. Oh, the cultural analysis. Zix'Thrax's scales shifted to the deep blue of profound regret. That's where we really messed up. See, we intercepted their entertainment broadcasts, but our analysts couldn't distinguish between their fiction and reality. They spent 3 weeks preparing defenses against something called Godzilla before someone realized it wasn't a real threat. He gestured expansively with his secondary appendages. We had battle plans drawn up to counter something called Chuck Norris, because our intelligence suggested he could divide by 0 and count to infinity twice. We dedicated an entire fleet to watching for a Doctor Who because the data suggested they could rewrite time itself. The mechanoid's cooling fans whirred thoughtfully. Error in data interpretation noted. Error doesn't begin to cover it, Zix'Thrax grumbled. We monitored their global information networks for military intelligence and instead got something called Reddit. Do you know how many human military tactics were developed because someone said, "Hold my beer"? Neither do we, because every time we tried to catalogue them, our analysts needed psychological counselling. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. And then there was the incident with their video games. We thought we'd discovered their military training simulations. Spent months analysing something called Doom because we thought it was their standard close-quarters combat training. Had our best xenobiologists trying to figure out how humans could carry that many weapons at once. The Verdani's bioluminescence flickered with suppressed laughter. Surely you realized these were entertainment products? Eventually, Zix'Thrax admitted, his scales briefly flashing embarrassment purple, but not before we'd redesigned our entire close combat doctrine to account for something called rocket jumping, and requisitioned research into why none of our warriors could carry more than 2 weapons at once without dropping them. He absently traced the rim of his glass with a claw. But the worst part? The absolute worst part? When we finally did figure out what was entertainment and what wasn't, the real humans turned out to be even more incomprehensible than their fiction. We found military footage of something called a gender reveal party that caused more destruction than some of our orbital bombardments. The blob burbled something that might have been a question about military strategy. Strategy? Zix'Thrax's scales rippled with a pattern that the Kazari language had no word for, but roughly translated to laughing while crying. How do you strategize against a species that responds to extraterrestrial surveillance by making memes about it? We detected a group of humans who spotted one of our cloaked observation ships, and instead of panicking, they created something called an Instagram challenge to pose with the mystery lights. He shook his head, all 3 of his hearts clearly heavy with the memory. By the time we realized what we were actually dealing with, it was too late. We had already committed to the invasion, and the High Command wouldn't accept that we should reconsider based on the fact that humans seem to operate on what our xenopsychologists could only classify as weaponized chaos. The mechanoid's display showed the closest approximation of a smirk that their kind could manage. You initiated invasion protocols anyway. Unfortunately, Zix'Thrax's scales had shifted to the mottled pattern that indicated deep psychological trauma. And that, my friends, is when things got really weird. Zix'Thrax's scales began pulsing in the strange pattern that his therapist had warned him about as he continued the story. The other bar patrons had gone completely silent, even the usually rowdy Martian miners in the corner. Standard invasion protocol dictates starting with psychological warfare, he explained, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had watched their entire military doctrine crumble like wet paper. We positioned our planet-killer ships in formation above their major cities, broadcast the traditional surrender or be annihilated message on all frequencies. You know, the classics. The Vidani nodded enthusiastically. And they cowered in fear? They turned it into a music remix. Zix'Thrax's secondary breathing sacs wheezed in distress. Within 6 hours, humans had auto-tuned our Supreme Commander's threat speech and set it to something they called sick beats. It got 10 million likes on something called TikTok. Our psychological warfare experts still can't explain how a species responds to imminent extinction by making dance videos. The mechanoid's processors whirred as they attempted to compute this response. Illogical reaction to existential threat detected. Illogical doesn't even scratch the surface, Zix'Thrax continued, gesturing for another drink. We tried to demonstrate our power by disintegrating one of their small moons. They responded with something called memes, millions of them. There was one about "that's no moon" that kept getting shared with lots of little pictures of some human in black breathing apparatus. He shuddered, causing ripples in his drink. Then came Operation Certain Victory. Ha! We should have called it Operation Certain Humiliation. We launched our first ground assault in a place called Florida because our sensors indicated it had the highest concentration of what we thought were their warriors, humans, who regularly engaged in combat with large reptilian creatures in swamps. The blob gurgled questioningly. Those weren't warriors, Zix'Thrax said, his voice hollow. Those were just Floridians. We lost an entire battalion when one of them decided to wrestle our heavy assault mechs because, and I quote, "Hold my beer, y'all, this looks fun." His scales flickered in the pattern reserved for recounting great battles, though the color suggested more trauma than glory. We had to withdraw from 3 different cities because humans kept trying to take what they called selfies with our death squads. Do you know how demoralizing it is to have your elite shock troops pose for photos with grinning humans making something called peace signs? The Vidani's antennae curled in amusement. Surely your superior technology... Superior technology, Zix'Thrax interrupted with a bark of laughter. We lost half our automated combat drones because humans kept throwing things called Roombas at them, and the drones got confused about which were the enemy robots. The other half got hacked and reprogrammed to play something called doom music while they patrolled. He pressed a button on his translator device, ensuring it was working correctly before continuing. But the pizza incident, that was what broke us. The Supreme Commander himself still can't talk about it without his scales turning white. The entire bar leaned in closer. We had finally captured what we thought was a critical human command center, Zix'Thrax explained, his voice dropping to a whisper. Turned out to be something called a Pizza Hut. But before we realized our mistake, a human youth approached our fortified position and said he was making a delivery. His scales rippled with remembered confusion. Our sensors detected no weapons, so we let him approach. He handed our forward commander a flat circular container and said, "That'll be $24.99. When the commander didn't respond, he just left it there, said something about it being paid for online and walked away. The mechanoid's display pulsed with curiosity. Threat assessment. We spent 6 hours analyzing that container, Zix'Thrax said, shaking his head. Brought in our best xenobiologists. Ran every scan we had, finally decided it must be some sort of primitive peace offering and opened it. He downed his drink in one gulp. It was covered in something called pineapple. The chemical reaction, the blob burbled. No, the fruit, on what they called pizza. Our cultural database indicated this was highly controversial, even among humans. Half our invasion force immediately began arguing about whether this was an insult or a delicacy. 3 cruiser crews mutinied over the debate. By the time we realized it was just food, the humans had somehow turned the entire incident into something called a viral marketing campaign. Zix'Thrax's scales had taken on the pale color of battlefield shock. The human corporation that made the pizza saw their stock value triple. They started advertising so good, even aliens invade for it. We intercepted messages from their military suggesting they were going to start using pizza delivery vehicles to penetrate our defenses because, and this is a direct quote, LOL, it worked once. He gestured at his scars. Do you know how I got these? Not in glorious combat, not defending my ship. I got them trying to escape a human gathering called a flash mob that formed around our heavy assault column. Thousands of humans just dancing. Our sensors couldn't distinguish potential combatants from civilians because they were all moving in synchronization. The entire attack formation collapsed in confusion. The Verdani's bioluminescence flickered rapidly. But your species wrote the book on psychological warfare. Wrote the book? Zix'Thrax let out a sound that might have been a laugh if it wasn't so close to a sob. Humans took that book, drew funny faces in it, posted it online with comments about how cute our tactics were, and then proceeded to accidentally wage the most effective counter-psychological warfare campaign in galactic history. They weren't even trying to break us. They were just being human. He traced one claw along his sensory ridge, his voice growing distant. But all of that was just the warm-up. The real breaking point came when they decided to get creative. Zix'Thrax's scales had taken on the pale, shimmering pattern that Kazari military physicians had officially classified as PTSD from human exposure. The breaking point, he laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. It started when our encrypted battle channel suddenly went silent. Then, the music started. His secondary breathing sacs fluttered erratically. A human in outdated clothing dancing. Our best cryptographers couldn't stop it. Every frequency, every channel. Just this one human dancing, singing about never giving up. The mechanoid's display flickered. A cyber attack? We thought so at first, then we learned the humans had a name for it. Rickrolling. It wasn't even a military operation. Just some teenagers who thought it would be, and I quote, totally epic, bro. He shuddered. Do you know what it does to military morale when your fearsome invasion force becomes a planetary-scale meme? The Verdani's antennae twitched. Surely your warriors maintained discipline. Discipline. Zix'Thrax barked out another hollow laugh. Try maintaining discipline when humans start responding to your battlefield commands with quotes from their entertainment archives. We'd order an advance and they'd respond with, you shall not pass. Call for surrender, they'd yell, this is the way. Launch an orbital bombardment, they'd transmit something about mothership that had our cultural analysts debating whether they were actually in contact with our fleet commander's maternal parent. The blob rippled inquiringly about the Florida maneuver. Zix'Thrax's scales went completely white. We don't talk about the Florida maneuver, not officially, but... He glanced around nervously before continuing. Our tactical computers identified a pattern in Florida human behavior that defied all known laws of probability. They would do exactly what our predictive algorithm said was too irrational for any sentient being to attempt. He leaned forward, voice dropping to a whisper. We had a containment field around their peninsula. Triple-layered energy barriers, orbital coverage, the works. Know what they did? They attached primitive propulsion devices to something called an airboat, filled it with something called gator nuggets and beer, and somehow went through our shields. Impossible, the mechanoid's cooling fans whirred in disbelief. That's what our physics department said. They're still studying the readings, the human's explanation. Florida man doesn't care about your alien physics. Zix'Thrax's scales rippled in remembered confusion. Next thing we knew, they were doing it everywhere, calling it the Florida maneuver, deliberately doing whatever our tactical computers predicted had a 0% probability of success. The Verdani's bioluminescence pulsed rapidly. And it worked? Worked. It broke our entire strategic AI network. The system couldn't handle the cognitive dissonance of being consistently wrong about what was impossible. Started spitting out errors about humans violating the laws of probability. called them quantum anomalies with a behavioral pattern best described as "hold my beer." He stared into his empty glass. That's when the existential crisis hit our troops. Our warriors started asking dangerous questions. Why do humans laugh in the face of superior firepower? How can a species simultaneously be advanced enough to crack our encryption, but choose to use that capability to share images of small animals they call memes? Why do they keep offering our troops something called hot pockets? The blob burbled something that might have been sympathy. Our xenopsychologists were overwhelmed, warriors reporting to medical bays with complaints about humans not making sense, strategic commanders unable to process how their perfect plans were being defeated by what humans called winging it. The final straw was when our supreme commander spent 6 hours watching something called cat videos and then ordered a fleet-wide retreat because, in his words, "We cannot defeat a species that has weaponized chaos itself." Zix'Thrax's scales shifted to the deep blue of philosophical resignation. Do you know what it does to a warrior culture to realize that everything we knew about warfare, about strategy, about the very nature of conflict, was rendered meaningless by a species that treats planetary invasion like an excuse for social media content? The bar had grown so quiet you could hear the blob's gentle sloshing. That's why we left, not because they defeated us militarily. Technically, they never did. We left because we looked into the abyss of human absurdity, and the abyss sent us a friend request. Zix'Thrax's scales had settled into the dull, muted pattern that veteran Kazari warriors now called post-human stress disorder as he approached the end of his tale. Technically, the Kazari Empire remains undefeated in conventional warfare, he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned that conventional was a highly relative term. But we had to create an entirely new classification for Earth in our tactical databases. It's now listed as approaching with extreme caution. We'll probably make memes about it. The mechanoid's display pulsed with calculation patterns. Query: current diplomatic status. That's the most frustrating part, Zix'Thrax said, gesturing for what he promised himself would be his final drink. The humans sent us a formal invitation to establish diplomatic relations through something called Twitter. The message included several small animated images of something called SpongeBob and ended with "No hard feelings, LOL." The Verdani's antennae twitched in confusion. And the Empire accepted? We had to. Do you know what happens when you ignore human diplomatic overtures? They start making conspiracy theories. Within weeks, their global information network was filled with speculation that we left because we were secretly controlled by something called lizard people who were scared of their flat Earth. He shuddered. Our xenosociologists still can't tell if they were joking. The blob rippled in what might have been amusement. The Galactic Council had to establish new laws after our experience, Zix'Thrax continued. Article 247, subsection C now explicitly states, never attempt to invade a species that responds to extinction-level threats with humor. There's a classified addendum that just says, especially if they're human. He traced the scars on his sensory ridge thoughtfully. The really concerning part? Other species started studying them. The Arctuvian swarm attempted to replicate human meme warfare. The Quantum Collective tried to understand their viral marketing. The hive mind of Beetlejuice spent 3 cycles analyzing something called dad jokes as a potential psychological weapon. Results, the mechanoid inquired. All failed. That's what makes humans unique and terrifying. They don't weaponize chaos, they embody it. They don't plan to be unpredictable, they just are. Our finest military academies now teach the human paradox. The only predictable thing about them is their unpredictability. Zix'Thrax's scales flickered with the pattern of hard-earned wisdom. You know what the humans did after we left? They started selling t-shirts saying, I survived the alien invasion and all I got was this lousy shirt. They turned our most advanced warships into internet memes. There's even a holiday theme park ride called the Kazari Experience, where they reenact our retreat with dancing mascots. The Verdani's bioluminescence dimmed thoughtfully. But surely the Empire has recovered its dignity. Dignity? Zix'Thrax laughed, but this time there was genuine amusement in it. We had to establish an entire department just to handle human internet interactions. Every time we issue a diplomatic statement, They respond with something they call GIFs. Our ambassador needed therapy after trying to understand why humans kept sending her pictures of something called Baby Yoda. He straightened up, his scales shifting to the formal pattern of official testimony. Let me give you younglings some wisdom earned through painful experience. Never underestimate a species that treats galactic warfare like a social media event. Never threaten a civilization that responds to doomsday weapons with dance videos. And most importantly, never ever try to apply logic to a species that conquered the galaxy's most feared empire by basically not taking us seriously enough to fight properly. The bar had grown crowded as other patrons gathered to listen. Even Rickroll, the bartender, had stopped pretending to clean glasses. The Kazari Empire now has exactly one core military doctrine regarding Earth, Zix'Thrax concluded, rising unsteadily to his feet. If you see humans, do not engage. If you must engage, do not threaten. If you must threaten, be prepared for them to turn it into content for something called YouTube. And if they start mentioning something called Florida, retreat immediately. He turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and one final piece of advice? His scales flickered with the pattern used for sharing sacred wisdom. If a human ever says, hold my beer or watch this, get off the planet. Just trust me on this one. As Zix'Thrax made his way toward the exit, the Verdani called after him. But what about the Empire's reputation? Surely other species don't respect. Respect, Zix'Thrax turned back, his scales showing the closest thing to genuine amusement they'd displayed all evening. Young one, we're the only empire in galactic history smart enough to realize that some victories aren't worth the memes they generate. That's not a defeat, that's survival. With that, the veteran warrior stepped out into the neon-lit street, leaving behind a bar full of stunned aliens and one very important lesson. In a galaxy full of fearsome species, sometimes the most terrifying ones are those who face cosmic horror with a smartphone in one hand and a witty caption in mind. The blob, showing more insight than its gelatinous form suggested, burbled what everyone was thinking. No wonder they classify Earth as a Class X planet, X for don't even think about it.